This is HOA Karen Patrol. Let me set the scene fast. I am here to keep order, Barbara shouted, and she was smiling when she said it. She had her phone camera held chest high, aimed right at my face, and she was documenting everything. The fence panels were sitting in my driveway, still strapped together, waiting for the contractor to show up in the morning. I had been home for maybe 20 minutes. I live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in a neighborhood called Brookhaven Greens, and the Brookhaven Greens Homeowners Association treats vendors like muscle and pretends it is policy. I work as a licensed electrician, and I am supporting family back home. I cannot afford surprise fees or a tow bill. Barbara Hayes is the social committee chair, and she spreads rumors faster than the board sends violation notices. She jabbed her finger toward the fence panels and said, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." Visible storage, she added, and her key ring with too many keys jingled loudly as she pulled a folded paper from her cardigan pocket. I could see the Brookhaven Greens letterhead. The fine was $50 per day, retroactive to this morning, and it would reset every time I tried to comply. I asked her what compliance even looked like, and she smiled wider. "Make it public," she said. I love watching people get embarrassed. I did not stop her, because I wanted her on record. A rideshare driver was parked across the street, window down, waiting for his passenger. He rolled his eyes when Barbara turned to wave the notice at him too, like she wanted a witness for her side. She said the board had voted unanimously to enforce visible storage rules, and if I did not move the panels immediately, the association would authorize a tow. I asked when that vote happened, and she said last Thursday. I asked for a copy of the meeting minutes, and she said they were not available yet. That was my first clue. The fence panels were for a repair on my back property line. The old fence had rotted through in 2 sections, and my neighbor on the other side had agreed we would split the cost. I had pulled a permit from the city, and the contractor was scheduled to start in the morning. The panels were sitting in my driveway because the lumberyard delivered early, and I did not have a truck big enough to haul them myself. It was one afternoon. Barbara took another picture and said she was filing an emergency compliance complaint. Then she walked away, keys jingling, still smiling. I went inside and pulled up the HOA portal to check my account. There was already a $50 charge dated that morning, 6 hours before the panels even arrived. The description said visible storage violation, first occurrence. I called the management company and got voicemail. I left a message asking for the board meeting minutes and the rule citation. Then I started building a timeline packet. I am methodical. I saved the delivery receipt, the permit approval from the city, the text thread with my neighbor, and the invoice from the contractor showing the scheduled start date. I took photos of the fence panels in my driveway with timestamps. I printed everything and put it in a folder. I knew I would need it. The next morning, the contractor showed up at 7. His name was Miguel, and he had been doing fence work in Milwaukee for 15 years. He took one look at the violation notice taped to my garage door and shook his head. He said the HOA had called him the night before and told him not to start the job. They said I did not have approval, and if he proceeded, they would ban him from working in Brookhaven Greens. I told Miguel I had the city permit, and he said the city permit did not matter to the HOA. He said he had seen this before. The association would drag it out, fine me daily, and eventually file a lien if I did not back down. He said he could not afford to get blacklisted, and he apologized. Then he loaded the panels back into his truck and left. I called the management company again. This time someone picked up. Her name was Dana, and she sounded tired. I explained the situation, and she said she would look into it. I asked about the meeting minutes, and she said they were still being finalized. I asked how a vote could be enforced before the minutes were finalized, and she said she would get back to me. She did not. The fine doubled on day 3. The new notice said continued non-compliance, and the amount was now $100 per day. I still had not received the meeting minutes. The management portal was down, and I had to deliver paper proof in person to the HOA office that afternoon. The office was in a strip mall on the north side of the neighborhood, and it was only open from 2 to 4 on weekdays. I got there at 2:15 with my timeline packet. The office was a single room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a receptionist who did not look up when I walked in. I asked to submit documentation for an appeal, and she said appeals had to be submitted in writing to the board within 10 days of the violation notice. I said I was submitting it right now, and she said the board would review it at the next meeting. I asked when that was, and she said 3 weeks. I asked about the meeting minutes again. She sighed and opened a drawer. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to me. It was labeled draft minutes, and the date was last Thursday. There was a line item that said visible storage enforcement approved, but there were no details. No vote count, no discussion summary, no rule citation. I asked if this was the official record, and she said it would be once the board president signed it. I took a photo of the draft minutes with my phone. Then I asked for a copy, and she said copies were 25 cents per page. I paid her $0.25, and she made a copy on a machine that sounded like it was dying. I added the copy to my timeline packet and left. That night, I got a call from a real estate agent named Claire. She lived 3 streets over, and we had talked a few times at neighborhood events. She said she heard about my fence situation, and she wanted to warn me. She said if the HOA filed a lien, it would show up on my disclosure statement, and it would kill my ability to sell or refinance. She said she had seen it happen twice in Brookhaven Greens, and both homeowners ended up paying the HOA everything they demanded just to clear the lien. Claire said she had a friend on the board who owed her a favor, and she would see what she could find out. I thanked her and added her number to my contacts. The next day, Barbara showed up at my house again. This time she had a small collapsible step stool, and she set it up at the corner of my property line. She climbed onto it and held a tape measure up to the top of my back fence. She called out numbers to herself and took more pictures. I watched from the window and did not go outside. She did not knock. She just packed up her step stool and left. That afternoon, I got an email from the management company. The subject line said compliance hearing scheduled. The body said I was required to attend a hearing on Friday at 6 in the evening, and if I did not attend, the board would proceed with enforcement action in my absence. The email did not say what the hearing was about, and it did not include any documentation. I replied asking for the agenda and the specific rule citations. I got an auto reply saying the office was closed for the day. Claire called me that night. She said her friend on the board told her the meeting minutes had been altered after the vote. The original motion was about seasonal decorations, not visible storage. Someone had gone back and changed the line item after the meeting, and the board president had signed the altered version. Claire said her friend was afraid to speak up because Barbara controlled the social committee budget, and she had a history of retaliating against anyone who questioned her. That was the trump card. I asked Claire if her friend would put it in writing, and she said no. But she said if I filed a records request with the management company, they would have to produce the original draft and the timestamps would show the alteration. I filed the records request that night. I asked for all drafts of the meeting minutes from the last board meeting, including metadata and edit history. I sent it to the management company and copied the entire board. I did not mention what I knew. I just wanted it on record. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit that like button and subscribe, because HOA drama only gets wilder from here. The hearing was on Friday, and I spent the week building my case. I added the records request to my timeline packet. I printed the email from the management company scheduling the hearing. I printed the city permit showing I had approval to replace the fence. I printed photos of the rotted sections that needed repair. I took a photo of the draft minutes the receptionist had given me, and I highlighted the part where there were no details. Claire called me Wednesday night and said Barbara had sent an email to the entire neighborhood group chat accusing me of ignoring HOA rules and threatening property values. The email said I was staging construction materials in violation of community standards, and it included a photo of my driveway with the fence panels. Claire forwarded me the email, and I saved it. Thursday afternoon, a man showed up in my yard unannounced. He was wearing a polo shirt with a vendor logo and carrying a clipboard. He said he was with the landscaping company the HOA used, and he needed to inspect my fence line for encroachment. I asked who authorized the inspection, and he said the board president. I told him I did not consent to an inspection, and he said the HOA had an easement for maintenance access. I asked to see the easement paperwork, and he said he did not have it with him. I told him to leave, and he said he was just doing his job. I told him I would call the police if he did not leave my property, and he muttered something under his breath and walked back to his truck. I took a photo of his truck with the company name visible. I added it to my timeline packet. The hearing was in the clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance with a meeting room and a kitchenette. I got there 10 minutes early with my timeline packet in a folder. The board was already seated at a folding table. The president, the treasurer, Barbara, and 2 other members I did not recognize. There were folding chairs set up in rows, and about a dozen homeowners were sitting in the audience. Claire was there, and she gave me a small nod. The board president called the meeting to order and said they were convening a compliance hearing for visible storage violations. He said I would have 5 minutes to present my case, and then the board would vote on enforcement action. I stood up and said I wanted to submit my documentation for the record. He said I could hand it to the secretary after I spoke. I started by explaining the situation. I said the fence panels were delivered early by the lumberyard, and they were staged in my driveway for one afternoon before the contractor was scheduled to start work. I said I had a city permit for the repair, and I showed the permit. I said the contractor was intimidated by the HOA and refused to proceed. I said the fines were escalating daily, and I had not been provided with the rule citation or the meeting minutes. Barbara interrupted and said the rule was clear. She said visible storage was prohibited under community standards, and the board had voted to enforce it. I asked her to cite the specific section of the rules, and she said it was in the CC&Rs. I asked which page, and she said she did not have the document in front of her. The board president told her to let me finish. I continued and said I had filed a records request for the meeting minutes, and I had received a draft that contained no details about the vote. I said the timeline did not make sense because the fine was backdated to the morning before the panels were delivered. I said I believed the enforcement was selective and retaliatory. Barbara stood up and said I was wasting everyone's time. She said the board had the authority to enforce community standards, and if I did not like it, I could move. The board president told her to sit down. She sat down, but she was glaring at me. I finished by saying I was requesting the board suspend the fines, pending a review of the rules and the meeting minutes. I handed my timeline packet to the secretary and sat down. The board president said they would deliberate and vote. He asked the other board members if they had any questions. The treasurer asked if the city permit overrode HOA rules, and the president said it did not. Barbara said the enforcement was justified and the fines should continue. One of the other board members, an older man, asked if there was a process for appealing fines, and the president said there was, but it required a written submission within 10 days. I stood up and said I had submitted a written appeal that afternoon at the HOA office. The receptionist had accepted it and said it would be reviewed at the next board meeting. The president looked at the secretary and she nodded. He said they would take my appeal under advisement, but the fines would remain in effect until the next meeting. I asked when that was, and he said 3 weeks. I said the fines would be over $4,000 by then, and I could not afford that. He said the board could not make exceptions. Barbara smiled. I sat down and waited. The board voted to uphold the fines and authorize continued enforcement. The vote was 4-1, with the older man dissenting. The president said the hearing was concluded, and the next item on the agenda was landscaping contracts. I walked out with Claire. She said the whole thing was rigged, and the board was afraid of Barbara. She said the only way to win was to find proof of misconduct and force the management company to intervene. I told her I already had proof, and I was waiting for the records request response. The response came 2 days later. It was a PDF attachment from the management company with 3 files: the original draft minutes, the revised draft minutes, and the final signed minutes. The metadata showed the original draft had been created on Thursday night at 8:15, right after the board meeting. The revised draft had been created on Friday morning at 10:30, and the line item about seasonal decorations had been replaced with visible storage enforcement. The final signed minutes matched the revised draft, and the signature was dated Friday afternoon. I printed all 3 files and added them to my timeline packet. I forwarded the email to Claire and asked her if her friend on the board would confirm what she had told me. Claire said her friend was willing to submit a written statement if I promised to keep her name confidential until it was absolutely necessary. I agreed. The next morning, I got a call from the management company. It was Dana, the woman I had spoken to earlier. She said the board president had reviewed my records request response and wanted to schedule a follow-up meeting. She said he was concerned about the timeline discrepancy, and he wanted to clarify what happened. I said I would attend if the meeting was recorded and the minutes were made available immediately. She said she would pass that along. The follow-up meeting never happened. Instead, I got another email from Barbara. The subject line said final warning. The body said the HOA had authorized a stop work order on my property, and any construction activity would result in additional fines and legal action. The email said the order was effective immediately, and it would remain in place until I brought my property into full compliance with community standards. I forwarded the email to Claire and asked her what compliance meant. She said it meant Barbara wanted me to give up. I said I was not giving up. The same afternoon, a surveyor showed up. His name was Tom, and he was hired by my neighbor to confirm the property line before we proceeded with the fence repair. Tom was a professional, and he had done surveys all over Milwaukee. He set up his equipment in my side yard and started measuring. Barbara appeared within 10 minutes. She walked right up to Tom and demanded to know who hired him. Tom said he was working for my neighbor and he was conducting a boundary survey. Barbara said the survey was unnecessary because the property line was clearly marked. Tom said the markers were old and unreliable, and a new survey was standard practice for shared fence projects. Barbara said the HOA had the right to review any survey before construction could proceed. Tom looked at me, and I said the HOA did not have that authority. Barbara said she would file an emergency motion with the board, and she pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of Tom's equipment. Tom ignored her and continued working. She kept interrupting him, asking questions about the measurements, and demanding to see his credentials. Tom finally said if she did not stop interfering, he would call the police for harassment. Barbara stepped back but did not leave. She stood 10 feet away with her phone out, recording everything. Tom finished his measurements and packed up his equipment. He said the property line was exactly where my neighbor and I thought it was, and the old fence was encroaching by about 6 inches on my side. He said he would file the survey with the county and send us both copies. After Tom left, Barbara walked up to me and said the survey proved I was in violation. I asked her how a survey proving the fence was on my property could be a violation, and she said the encroachment meant I had been maintaining an illegal structure. I said the fence was there when I bought the house, and I was repairing it to bring it into compliance. She said, "You do not get an opinion, you get a fine schedule." I told her I was done talking to her, and I walked inside. That night, Claire called me with more information. Her friend on the board had found out that Barbara had ordered extra hardware from a fencing supplier 3 weeks earlier, right before I placed my order for the fence panels. The order included gate hinges, latches, and alignment brackets that did not match the standard specifications for my fence type. Claire said her friend suspected Barbara was planning to sabotage my gate installation so it would not close properly, and then she could cite me for another violation. I asked Claire how her friend knew this, and she said Barbara had submitted the receipt to the HOA for reimbursement, claiming it was for a community gate repair. But the gate she listed was not scheduled for repair, and the hardware did not match. Claire said her friend had copied the receipt before Barbara pulled the reimbursement request. That was the second part of the trump card. I asked Claire if her friend could get me a copy of the receipt, and she said she already had. She texted me a photo of the receipt with the date, the supplier name, and the itemized hardware list. I printed it and added it to my timeline packet. I now had proof that the board minutes had been altered after the meeting, and proof that Barbara had ordered Sabotage hardware on the HOA's dime. I had the city permit, the survey, the records request response, and the reimbursement receipt. I had a timeline that showed selective enforcement, contractor intimidation, and retaliation. I had everything I needed, but I did not deploy it yet. I wanted Barbara on record one more time. The next day, I scheduled a private meeting with the board president. I told him I had new information about the compliance case, and I wanted to present it before the next board meeting. He agreed to meet me at the clubhouse on Saturday morning. I got there early with my timeline packet. The board president arrived 15 minutes late. His name was Robert, and he looked tired. He said he had reviewed my appeal, and he was concerned about the way the case had been handled. He said Barbara had been pushing for aggressive enforcement, and he had gone along with it because the board generally deferred to committee chairs on their areas. I said I understood, but I had evidence that the enforcement was not legitimate. I opened my timeline packet and showed him the records request response with the altered meeting minutes. I walked him through the metadata timestamps and the line item change. His face went pale. He asked if I had shared this with anyone else, and I said I had sent it to the entire board when I filed the request. He said he had not seen it. I pulled up the email on my phone and showed him the recipient list. His name was on it. He said his inbox was flooded, and he must have missed it. I showed him the receipt for the Sabotage hardware. I explained that Barbara had ordered the hardware 3 weeks before my fence project, and she had tried to get the HOA to reimburse her for it. I said the hardware did not match any scheduled community repair, and the timeline suggested it was intended to interfere with my gate installation. Robert sat back in his chair and rubbed his face. He said if this was true, Barbara had committed fraud and violated her fiduciary duty as a board member. He said the HOA could be liable if I decided to sue, and the insurance company would probably refuse to cover it because it was intentional misconduct. He asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted the fines reversed, I wanted a formal apology from the board, and I wanted Barbara removed from the social committee and banned from contacting homeowners outside official meetings. I said if the board did not vote to make that happen at the next meeting, I would send my timeline packet to every homeowner in Brookhaven Greens, and I would file a complaint with the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. Robert said he would talk to the rest of the board. He said he could not make any promises, but he thought they would agree. He asked me to keep the evidence confidential until the meeting, and I said I would, as long as the meeting happened on schedule. The meeting was 2 weeks later. I got there early and sat in the front row. Claire was there, and so were about 30 other homeowners. Barbara was at the board table, and she looked smug. She did not know what was coming. The board president called the meeting to order and said they had a special agenda item to address. He said the board had received new information related to a recent compliance case, and they needed to discuss it in open session. Barbara's smile faded. Robert asked me to present my evidence. I stood up and walked to the front. I handed each board member a copy of my timeline packet, and I kept one for myself. I started with the altered meeting minutes. I explained the metadata timestamps and the line item change. I said the original motion had nothing to do with visible storage, and someone had altered the record after the vote to justify selective enforcement. Barbara tried to interrupt, but Robert told her to wait. I continued with the contractor intimidation, the backdated fines, the stop work order, and the vendor showing up in my yard without authorization. I showed them the city permit and the survey proving my fence was legal and on my property. Then I showed them the receipt for the Sabotage hardware. I explained that Barbara had ordered the hardware 3 weeks before my project, and she had tried to get the HOA to reimburse her for it. I said the hardware did not match any scheduled repair, and the timeline suggested it was intended to interfere with my gate so she could cite me for another violation. The room went silent. Barbara stood up and said I was lying. She said the hardware was for a legitimate repair, and she had submitted the receipt by mistake. I asked her which repair, and she did not answer. Robert asked her to sit down. One of the other board members, the older man who had dissented at the hearing, said he had suspected something was wrong, but he did not have proof until now. He said Barbara had a history of using her committee position to target homeowners she did not like, and the board had looked the other way for too long. He said it was time to hold her accountable. The board voted to reverse all fines related to my case. The vote was 4-1, with Barbara dissenting. Then they voted to censure Barbara in public for misconduct, strip her social committee powers, and ban her from contacting homeowners outside official meetings. The vote was 4-1 again. Barbara stood up and said they could not do this. She said she had done nothing wrong, and the board was retaliating against her for enforcing the rules. Robert said the evidence spoke for itself, and the decision was final. He said if she did not accept the censure, the board would move to remove her from the board entirely and refer the matter to the HOA attorney for potential legal action. Barbara grabbed her key ring with too many keys, and the jingling filled the room. She said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." Then she realized what she had just said. Her face turned red. Someone in the audience laughed. She walked out without another word. Just as Barbara reached the door, a gust of wind from someone opening the exterior door caught her printed packet, and it went airborne. Pages scattered across the floor, some sliding under chairs, one landing in a potted plant. She tried to gather them, but people were stepping over them to leave. She gave up and walked out. The rideshare driver from 2 weeks earlier was parked outside again, and he saw the whole thing. He was laughing. 3 days later, I received a check from the HOA for a refund of fees that hit the ledger like a slap. It included the reversed fines, reimbursement for the records request, and a formal apology letter signed by Robert. The letter said the board regretted the way my case had been handled, and they were implementing new policies to prevent selective enforcement in the future. Claire called me that night and said Barbara had submitted her resignation from the board. She said Barbara claimed it was for personal reasons, but everyone knew why. Claire said her friend on the board told her the HOA attorney had forced a reversal to reduce liability, and Barbara had been advised to stay quiet or risk a lawsuit. The fence repair was completed 2 weeks later. Miguel, the contractor, came back and said he had heard what happened at the board meeting. He said word traveled fast in the contractor community, and everyone knew Barbara had been caught. He said he was glad to finish the job, and he gave me a discount on labor because he felt bad about backing out the first time. The new fence was perfect. The gate closed smoothly, the alignment was flawless, and the survey stakes confirmed everything was inside my property line. Barbara never came back. I saw her once from a distance, walking her dog on the other side of the neighborhood, and she turned around when she saw me. I kept my timeline packet in a filing cabinet, just in case. Claire said I should frame the altered meeting minutes as a trophy, but I told her I would rather forget the whole thing. She laughed and said that was fair. A few months later, the board held elections. The older man who had dissented ran for president, and he won. One of his first acts was to establish a formal appeals process with independent review, so no single board member could weaponize the rules. He also required the management company to publish meeting minutes within 72 hours, with full metadata and version history. Claire told me the new board was night and day compared to the old one. She said homeowners actually felt like the HOA was working for them instead of against them. I said it was about time. I still live in Brookhaven Greens. The neighborhood is quieter now. The social committee was restructured, and the new chair does not carry a step stool or a tape measure. The landscaping vendor that showed up in my yard was replaced after other homeowners complained about unauthorized inspections. The management company hired additional staff to handle records requests, and the portal actually works now. Barbara moved out 6 months after the board meeting. I heard she bought a condo in a building with no HOA. I hope she is happier there. I know I am happier here. The fence still stands, solid and square, right where the survey said it should be. Every time I walk past it, I think about that string line pulled tight, and the moment the surveyor explained the property line out loud while Barbara kept interrupting. I think about the receipt trail pointing straight to her, and the way the board voted to strip her powers in front of everyone. I think about how close I came to giving up, and how glad I am that I did not. I kept the gate latch I held up that first day as proof. It sits on a shelf in my garage, next to the timeline packet. I do not need it anymore, but I like having it there. It reminds me that documentation wins, and patience pays off, and sometimes the person screaming the loudest is the one with the most to hide. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.